to build this building, and you think you're going to now build it in 3 days. This is in John chapter 2, verse 18 to 20. So this is the atmosphere that Jesus, peace be upon him, arrives. As at Jesus' trial by the high priest, Jesus was accused of threatening to destroy this exact same temple that he's standing in, and the people are asking him. But in John's version, he adds, but he spoke of the temple of his body. You see, because in their trial that we find in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they don't clarify this. It's up to the reader to interpret. So John has to clarify it for us people, and he says, but he spoke of the temple of his body, not the physical temple that he would destroy. So he's speaking of the temple of his body in John chapter 2, verse 21. It is here that John introduces Nicodemus. Nicodemus is going to play a very, very important role. He is a man who is a ruler of the Jewish community. He's very well known, and he's a very influential man. You can read about him in John chapter 3, verse 1, who is to play a very, very important role in the burial of the prophet Isa, peace be upon him. Nicodemus came to Jesus at night secretly in a previous story that happens earlier in the Bible, and professes his faith, and he says that he believes that Jesus is a teacher come from God, and so he is believing that the prophet Isa, peace be upon him, is a messenger from God. And so in John's gospel we hear of him coming and making this declaration of faith. And it says, and after this Jesus went into Judea with his disciples, staying there, and was baptized, that we read in John chapter 3, verse 22. So this person is going to play a very, very important part. Now we go to John chapter 4, verse 1 to 4, and it says, a report now reached the Pharisees. Jesus is winning and baptizing more disciples than John, although in fact it was one of the disciples who was baptizing and not Jesus himself. So this is what we read in John chapter 4, verse 1 to 2. This is in conflict with what John writes in his own book in John chapter 3, verse 22, where he reported that the above is clearly a statement that Jesus himself had said. And it says that Jesus stayed there with them and baptized. So if it wasn't Jesus himself who baptized, as John chapter 4, verse 1 to 2 says, it wasn't Jesus himself who baptized one of the disciples, then that contradicts what John chapter 3, verse 22 says, when it says that he stayed there with them and baptized. It seems that John chapter 4, verse 1 to 4 was so worded for two reasons when we look at it now. The first reason is to assert that Jesus was making more disciples than John the Baptist, and to show them how he was superior to John the Baptist. Remember that there was a division that was taking place at that time between the followers of Jesus and the followers of John the Baptist. If you don't know the story, John the Baptist was the forerunner of Jesus, and so he prepared the way, according to the Bible, for the coming of Jesus. And so his disciples were following John the Baptist. Even when Jesus came along, more people were following John the Baptist than Jesus. So what John is trying to do now, I said Paul, maybe I gave that away, because you can see Paul's influence on John's writing. So the first thing is that we see that he is writing in this style, in this way, that Jesus has got more disciples, that he is superior to John the Baptist, whose disciples were still in large number while John had been writing his gospel that we're now reading. The second reason is to find an excuse, because in fact Jesus had not been a huge success in Judea. This second fact is indicated in John chapter 4, verse 3. So in John chapter 4, verse 3, it says, when Jesus learned this, he left Judea and set out once more for Galilee. Now, if Jesus was in fact winning disciples, then he did not need to leave Judea. So we know that unfortunately from his mission being not a very successful one, Jesus, unfortunately, his mission has to end, and he has to go to try and find better soil, to find a place where he would hopefully win more people. Jesus himself testifies in John chapter 4, verse 44. He says, a prophet hath no honor in his own country. Or as some translators say, a prophet is not known in his own town. So he has to leave there. As it is stated before in other texts and writings of John, John was writing his gospel at a time when Christianity had become a far more stronger religion amongst the Gentiles than it had amongst the Jews. And we explained that in episodes before. So John reports Jesus' dialogue with a story to show that he was actually supposed to be talking not only to the Gentiles, not only to the Jews, but to the whole of humanity, or to everybody. So John, in his writing, and you don't find this in the other Gospels, but you find it in John, John reports that Jesus' dialogue with a Samaritan woman took place, and this gives the impression that he conveyed his message even to the Samaritans, who the Jews considered as unclean. So a lot of what John does, he's trying to do in a way to prove that the message that the prophet Isa, peace be upon him, came with was not exclusively for the Jews, which is contrary to what Matthew in his gospel had recorded. Because in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 6 and 7, he says, "These Jesus set forth and commanded them, saying, Go not into the way of the Gentiles, or into the cities of the Samaritans, you shall not enter, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel," in other words, the Jews. So from Matthew's account, in Matthew chapter 10, verse 5 and 6, he very carefully commands his 12 disciples, and he sends them out with a command saying to them, do not go to the way of the Gentiles, into the cities of the Samaritans, don't even go there, and go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, or the Jews. This is in direct contradiction to what we see John saying. So later, when a Gentile woman even comes to Jesus, she asks for help. This is recorded in Matthew chapter 15, verse 22 to 26. He answers and said, "It is not meant for me to take the bread from the children and give it to the dogs." So Jesus is referring to the non-Jews as dogs. He says, it is not for me to take the bread from the children of the Jews and give it to the dogs. What is he saying by this? He's simply saying that this message is not for you. I cannot help you. I cannot help you. I can do nothing for you because this message is not for you. It's for the Jew that I have been sent. Another messenger will come and do that. And so this is in direct contradiction to what we find John saying now. It also goes on to say in Mark chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, "And they went out to the temple, one of the disciples, and said to them, Master, see what manner of stones and what manner of buildings here. And Jesus answered and said unto them, See thee these buildings, they shall not be one stone upon another, they shall all be thrown down." So Jesus, when speaking of a coming war and a famine and pestilence, he is talking about something similar to what we see in Matthew chapter 22 and what we see in Luke chapter 21. And what is interesting to note is that when these Gospels were written, when Matthew chapter 24 was written and when Luke chapter 21 was written, and they're talking about these one stone will not be on top of the other, when these famines and pestilences will take place, these events had already taken place and they're already part of history. So they were not something that these Gospel writers were writing that would happen in the future. These events had already happened by the time they had written these. You see, Christians like to say, well, these books were written 30 to 100 years later. And then when it comes to verses like this, they'll say, yes, but these books were only written 200 years later. So they can't have it both ways. They've got to make up their mind which was written before or after. But we know that these events were already part of history. And so John now mentions another journey to Jerusalem in John chapter 5. He likes to have Jesus going backwards and forwards to this place. That's because he hasn't got his facts straight. He hasn't got his story straight. So every now and then gets a mix-up and he has to bring people backwards and forwards. So in the next story that you see, we have John mentioning his journey to Jerusalem in John chapter 5, where he cites the story of a crippled person lying by the side of the sheep pool known as Bethsaida. It's a very well-known name in Christianity. Many people call their clinics, their hospitals, Bethsaida Clinic, where an angel would come and disturb the water, and whoever was the first person to plunge in after the angel had disturbed the water would recover from whatever affliction had affected him. And since this miracle was nothing to do with Jesus, but had to do with an angel that would come down and disturb the water, we find that nobody mentions it in the Bible except for John, because this would absolutely mean nothing. This doesn't prove that Jesus has any miracle power or anything like that. So many versions of the Bible, even those that have John chapter 5, omit this miracle. And they leave it out because this miracle would in itself just simply mean a miracle and had absolutely nothing to do with Jesus. So many versions of the Bible simply omit it and don't have it mentioned. The King James Version includes this verse, so does the Revised Bible Version, so does the Living Bible, but the New World Translation, the New English Bible, and the New International Version omit it, and they have written it and reason why they've omitted. They say this is to be found in some less important manuscripts. The conflict with the Jews deepens when the Jews accuse him of breaking the Sabbath, and this is we're going to go into in more detail in the next episode. There's so much to cover in this. When we get back, we'll continue. So from me, Areeb Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.